Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the freedom movement from 1964 to approximately 1968, but I will let you know that I won't be hitting even like close to all of the events that took place at that time. I'm just going to be giving you enough context really to supplement what is already in the unit for this week, as well as to give you some context for the assignment. And this also builds right on the other video that I made concentrating on JFK's response to the actions of individuals during the freedom movement between, I would say, 1960 and 1963, right? So this is like kind of part two. It won't be very long, so hopefully it will give you what you need in a short period of time. I'm going to jump right in. I don't really have an overview because it is quite short. When JFK was assassinated in 1963, Lyndon Johnson became president. Johnson, unlike Kennedy, was not a product of a privileged lifestyle, education, or family. So his political persona was very, very different than Kennedy's. He definitely prioritized domestic, particularly civil rights, and also policies like the war on poverty, right, as well as foreign relations. He also cleverly found a way to use Kennedy's death to overcome conservative resistance to legislation in Congress that particularly focused on one of his passions, which was civil rights, like African-American civil rights, right? He wasn't perfect in that respect, but he did think that this legislation was important, right? This led to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was a huge milestone in the country and actually grew out of something that Kennedy had called for and would have likely pressed for had he been able to remain president, had not been assassinated. It actually barred discrimination in employment, hospitals, schools, and public accommodations by race and sex, which also generated support from liberal and female members of Congress. Under LBJ's watch, the freedom movement did continue. In 1965, you do have the infamous Bloody Sunday incident at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma occurring. That is where civil rights marchers were violently and very viciously beaten by state troopers. Who attacked unarmed participants. The attempted march had actually begun on March 7th. It was initially prompted by the fatal shooting of Jimmy Lee Jackson, an African-American activist, by a state trooper when he was participating in a peaceful voting rights march in Macon, Alabama, right? And this had been planned as a response on March 7th by the SCLC's James Bevel and Amelia Boynton to support the local Dallas County Voters League, right? So I've noted before how, a lot of times the SCLC was really there to support those local organizations who were on the ground leading movements in different ways all across the South. A second march occurred on March 9th, led by Martin Luther King, who turned around at the bridge because he was actually waiting on a federal order that would fully protect the participants. That evening, another activist, a white Unitarian minister named James Reeb, was murdered, which sparked another march, right? This time, It was a 54-mile trek. All of this, actually, it wasn't just Reeb's death, but all of this sort of sparked the 54-mile trek. It got a lot of publicity because of Reeb, though, however. And that occurred from March 21st through March 25th, actually taking place over several days with individuals who then flooded the Alabama Capitol in Montgomery with thousands of protesters. You also see a national outcry that ultimately results in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The year before 1964, there had been similar issues and murders in Mississippi during the voting rights campaign sponsored by CORE and SNCC, right? So you see in June, you have the Freedom Summer as well. This is commonly known as the Freedom Summer, but it goes by other names as well. And this is the campaign that you may know, which resulted in the deaths of 2 white volunteers from the North named Michael Schwimmer and Andrew Goodman, who identified, I believe, ethnically, but perhaps not. I think that they did not identify religiously as Jewish, but they did identify ethnically as Jewish. Don't quote me on that. Though they were from the North and had come down as student volunteers, as well as James Chaney, who was a local Black activist. He was killed as well. By that time, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party had formed in April of 1964, opening itself actually to anyone, regardless of race, to fight the all-white primaries in southern states, which actually had been outlawed during FDR's time, but again, were not being really enforced, right? The party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, elected delegates to serve at the National Democratic Party Convention, which was to be held in Atlantic City that year, included very outspoken organizers, grassroots organizers and activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, E.W. Steptone, and Hazel Palmer. Hamer's testimony is the most famous. She actually got up and spoke, and you have some of that in your unit, her speech, about a lifetime of discriminatory sort of things that had affected her, and abuse, really, by the system, which could not get help, right, for many years, and all of that sort of was associated with her motivation for acting as part of the freedom movement, and sparked a lot of sympathy for her party, right? But further action, including the seating of the delegates at the convention, was denied by Lyndon Johnson. So you see some contradictions there, right? It becomes very complicated at this period of time. So the nature of support in and of itself is complicated even at the federal level. We saw that a little bit with Kennedy as well. And this occurs even though Johnson had otherwise been sympathetic to calls for fair treatment in the past. LBJ actually objected to the very militant tone of the group, the very radical tone of the group, and was fearful of violence because it had occurred many times in the past. He also worried about politics, right? As politicians do. He was afraid that a walkout of segregationist party members or conservative party members could damage his candidacy for president. And that was something that Truman had experienced with the Dixiecrats in 1948. So, he had some basis for those fears, but they did influence his behavior. Compromise was offered to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party of the seating of 2 delegates, of 2 of their delegates, not all of their delegates, but 2. and all of the regular or the white, right, delegates as well. But Hamer and other leaders of the MFDP saw this as a half-hearted attempt to placate them, especially since they had been denied a place at the negotiation table to begin with. So they had not been consulted about those negotiations, so they rejected it. And you can kind of think about all of this stuff as you are listening to Hamer's speech and sort of analyzing it in relation to what's in the textbook for this week and what we've discussed about civil rights and the freedom movement so far during these years. I will end for now. Please let me know if you have any questions. Bye.